Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network. Hello, everybody. I am Ross Morasso, and welcome to the show. My guest today, Sue Woodriffe, joins us out of Portsmouth, UK, from across the pond, as us nerds like to say. And she owns a alternative medical and therapy practice that does all kinds of wild stuff. And we have had her on the show before. And since COVID really happened, I think a lot of us had to look for alternative ways to heal ourselves or stay healthy. And through that search, people like Sue are having a bit of a renaissance in what they do for a living and people and our willingness to help everybody. So I'm happy to talk to her today. We've had her talk to her before, and she's got some really wild stuff, but it's been around for a while now. And I think it's just us who are starting to become more aware of all these alternative ways to heal ourselves that don't always involve pills. Hi, Sue. Welcome back.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So for those of us who are tuning in for the very first time, give us a brief overview of what it is that you do.
I work with people to resolve their issues, whatever that may be. Physical, I can do bow and technique if you're here, but online and on Zoom, I work with people to deal with their trauma, particularly. But also like anxiety, depression, repeating patterns, limiting beliefs, all those things that affect us that sometimes we don't realize we've got them, but then we realize there's something going wrong in our lives, and then we find out that's what it is.
You know, I asked, or I was commenting here, at the top of the show, I was mentioning COVID, and as we move into the quote unquote endemic stage of this disease, if you will, have you worked with any clients who have had the long COVID, as they're starting to term this?
The only people I work with the so-called long COVID I've dealt with Bowen, working with the lymphatic system. I haven't really had anybody wanting to do that on on Zoom and deal with the emotional aspects of it, or think that, I don't know. I'm sure it could help, but I personally haven't worked with anybody. But I have worked with people here who've had it, and when I do work with the lymphatic system, it does start to shift some of those symptoms.
Are some people finding relief from it?
Yes, definitely.
So there are several techniques that you use, like Bowen. We have this, we've talked about meta-consciousness in the past, the EFT for the emotional freedom technique, and then something called BLAST, which is an acronym. What is BLAST?
Well, the acronym is bilateral analysis. Does that sound right? Stimulated treatment. I can't remember what it stands for, but it's basically an eye movement technique, which people may be more familiar with EDMR, which I think came out earlier and was very medicalized. And so the sort of psychotherapists would be using it. But since the lady that created EDMR did that, there are other people who've looked at what she's doing and have done different versions of it and have got it out to more of us, so we don't have to be qualified psychotherapists in order to use it.
So you said EDMR, yeah. So go ahead, explain what this actually is.
It originally came out of the whole idea of eye movements, which came out of NLP, and the people who did NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming, they just looked at what other people did. So I don't know where this originally came from, but it became they were the first people that really started teaching that where your eyes are moving and tracking relates to what you're accessing in your brain. So looking from side to side tends to be auditory. When you look up, we're accessing the visual parts of our brain, and when we look down, we're accessing our emotions. Now that obviously isn't true if you look down to read something. So, but if I'm chatting to you and I'm kids do it, don't they? You ask them a question and they look up and you go, well, look at me when I'm speaking to you. Well, they're actually trying to access a memory, a visual memory, by looking up. And so so when we work with the eye with this technique, we're getting the eyes to move, and while we're talking, getting the eyes to move, we can actually. I don't know whether it actually can literally rewire the brain, but that's what a lot of people have told me it feels like. It feels like my brain's rewired. It just feels like it's rewired. That's all they keep saying.
So it's like some examples here. So let's say somebody has a memory that is causing them hardship in life for whatever reason.
Yes.
Would I be correct in saying that the technique sort of has them, or maybe in this particular example, right, focus on that memory or start to think about it, and then
Yes.
by watching the eyes, you get them to train to.
I've got a light that I move with my hand, and I get their eyes to follow the light, and I tell them about their unconscious processing it, and that their unconscious can process it, and somehow it takes all the energy out of it. It doesn't take the memory away, but you ask them how they feel afterwards, and they go, oh, well, don't feel much at all, really. It works when someone's in it, and that's the thing about this technique. Somebody's got to be. We talk about people being associated and dissociated. When you're associated with something, you're in it, you're feeling it, you're re-experiencing it. When you're dissociated from something, you can talk about it, but you don't feel anything. So you want somebody associated. They've got to be in it, feeling it, experiencing, re-experiencing it. And then that technique is fantastic for just taking the energy out, taking the emotion away out, taking the emotion out of it very quickly.
So like you get them to a space where they can still access this memory however they like,
Yes.
but now they're disassociated from it in terms of emotionally speaking.
They don't become dissociated. They actually can't act. They can't find whatever it was they were feeling about it. People dissociate from something in order to protect themselves.
Right.
So someone will come in and tell me about some terrible trauma they have, and they'll chat about it as though they were talking about their cornflakes they ate for breakfast. That's dissociation. They have so protected themselves from it, they can't feel anything about it anymore. But if you can get someone into the reliving it, and it's not a nice thing to do, really. But some people are so in it, they are reliving it. They are in it. They can never get out of it, and they're feeling it, and their body's expressing it. And you ask them, and you can almost see them start to curl up or go into the movement of whatever was going on. And then when you pick the light pen up and you start moving the pen, everything just calms down in an extraordinary way. And then you say to them, if you were at a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10 of how bad it is, where would you be now? And they go, oh, maybe a 2. All right, well, let's just do a little bit more. And then how are you now? Well, I know it happened, but I know it happened, but I don't really feel much about it. That's very different from like telling me about it in the way they told me their cornflakes. That's got a very different energy about it.
It's making me think of a few things. I once upon a time knew a Vietnam vet, and he was very open with talking about his experiences, very casual like. And
Yes.
I've talked with other veterans of war who will seize up, right? I use this as an example because it's a very just sort of obvious one. I think we all know globally that being war is hell, right? And I always found it interesting. And I asked him once, I said, you seem to be able to so freely talk about this stuff. And he just sort of said, well, I lived through it. And now he didn't do a blast technique, but I wonder if that sort of attitude is, and very detailed, right, about the battles and things that he was in that, of course, were horrific. And so would that maybe be, just to give an example to our listeners, is that an example of someone maybe being disassociated with the emotional context?
Well, it's possible that he was dissociated. It's also possible that he wasn't traumatized by it, however awful it was. And not everybody is. The people, the research has shown that the people who are most likely to end up with trauma and PTSD in adult life are people who've had childhood trauma. So you can have two soldiers go through a very similar experience. One had a really happy, secure childhood and has a loving family and has close connections with his fellow soldiers, and he's in a platoon and he stays with them and he's got that connection. He can get through it guy next to him, who was brought up in a children's home, didn't have the family, might have had a very difficult family life, and hasn't got that connection. He's the one that's going to end up with PTSD, or she.
How critical do you find it when you're working with your clients? Is this sort of bedrock of what our childhood was, or our interpretation of what our childhood was?
Absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. We pick up so much in our early years. We form beliefs about our lives, about ourselves and the world around us, and we hold on. Psychotherapists call them trauma capsules. We kind of hold trauma in ourselves somewhere. It's and if you've had a lot of trauma, as I said, in childhood, you're very, but you don't even know about it. You don't recognize it as such. You don't know it is, but you're far more likely to end up with more serious trauma when you're older. So those childhood experiences are formative, absolutely formative.
So can that give some of us, and look, we're all different, right? And everyone can overcome, and indeed some of the blast technique and some of the things that you do can assist people in, rewiring themselves, for lack of a better term. I think although correct me if I'm wrong in that. But for those of us who had childhood trauma, whether we know it or not, does that just become, like, for some of us, a fundamental deficiency in all areas of life when we're dealing with anything that is out of our comfort zone?
Well, it can be. I mean, if because of that childhood trauma, you might suppose you formed a belief that the world wasn't a safe place, but it's a very deep-seated belief, so you don't really know that you believe it, but you find yourself very risk-averse, very unadventurous, wanting to live this very, very quiet life. And it might not really fit with your personality, but you still keep yourself small and you keep yourself in a confined and safe space because you made a decision when you were 3 or 4 years old. The world out there is dangerous. Does that make sense?
It does. And so no matter how many times later after that decision, we run into situations that would counter that assumption about life and earth, that early initial choice can still take precedence and remain dominant?
Can do, yes. And it might depend how severe it is, but yes, the beliefs that we form when we're very young just tend to stay with us. Some of them serve us well, and some of them don't. But unless they become a problem, we don't need to address them. But if they do, then yes.
And then likewise, we can also get positive reinforcement that early on.
Yes, we can. If you grow up in a family that's very loving and your parents have, got your back and behind you, and you have good relationships with your siblings, and I'm not saying you have to have a perfect life, because of course you're in a family, there are things that happen, but essentially a loving family, then you're in a far better place to deal with the slings and arrows that we get hurled at us later in our lives.
I mean, it almost sounds like, and of course, depending on the person, but for those of us that were fortunate enough to have these loving, supporting environments in our formative years, as they say, are almost starting like 10 feet ahead at the start of every race then.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The difference between coming home from school and there's somebody there that goes, welcomes you in and, gives you a drink and says, how was your school day? So the person who comes home from school, not knowing I had a client, didn't know what his mother was going to be like when she came home. Best scenario was that she'd just say, shut up, I'm watching the television. Worst scenario, chasing him around the house with a hammer.
Oh.
Can how, if you grew up in that environment, do you ever cope in the world? Can you see how the difference when you're talking about a head start? It's huge. And I am going from one extreme to the other.
But that was a client of yours.
Mm.
Were you ever able to make headway though?
I only saw him once.
It was only once. But
and it was too much. Yeah. I can't go into it, but sometimes people really can't face looking at this stuff.
Sure. But for those of us that want to, where the living with it is worse than the just, getting on with it sort of thing, Do you find that these things like the blast technique and the emotional freedom technique, even though these things are that deep seated, can we transform ourselves so that these things are no longer subconsciously governing our choices in life?
Yes, we can. To a large degree, we can. If somebody's grown up in the kind of environment I was talking about, with a parent who is that unpredictable and that violent, the recovery is, you can get to a much better place, but there might be something left over, that some bits that you left over that you can't deal with, or you might find that somebody with really that difficult a childhood might find there are days when they just can't cope and they go to bed for a day, but then they get up and they're back in the swing and they're all right, because it's been extreme. But for the majority of people who've had a tough time rather than extremely rough time, yes, you can shift a lot, and you can get them to a much better place and functioning much better.
When you say tough versus extreme, though, I wonder how many of us, and I'd like your opinion on this, have had tough times, but because out in the world, so many of us have, we don't really acknowledge to ourselves that our said tough times could actually be affecting us in our adult life.
Oh, I think that's very true. I think we think that because we live it, we think it's normal for a start, and
Mm.
we see friends and other people in sort of similar-ish backgrounds or similar things that we don't think. Quite often, when I start working with somebody and they tell me they had this wonderful idyllic childhood, and as we start working through it, they suddenly realise that, well, maybe I didn't. Maybe it wasn't as good as it wasn't that. Maybe it wasn't as brilliant as I thought it was. Maybe the fact that my father was in the army and we moved every 2 years and I kept changing schools, maybe that wasn't as good as I thought it was. Maybe I didn't put down any roots. Maybe I didn't keep friends for any length of time. Maybe that did affect me. So it's not even that anything terrible's happened to them in terms of, they haven't suddenly had a parent who's erratic or difficult. It might just be circumstances, but they thought everything was hunky dory, and maybe it wasn't quite as good as they thought.
I think I'm going to speculate that I know the unfortunate answer you might give me. But let me ask you, how often do people come to you and they say, I don't really think I have anything obviously wrong with me. I'm just interested in these therapies because I want to make sure that I'm going to be the most, whatever, robust human being, living full out sort of person I can be. And I can't discount the possibility that maybe there's stuff that I don't know about and I'd like to discover it with you. How often does a client approach you that way?
I think I'm going to tell you it just doesn't happen.
Necessity is the mother of all invention, right? I think
Absolutely, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If people's lives are good and they're happy and they're doing well, and as far as they're concerned, their lives okay, why on earth do they want to start digging anything up? That's what most people would think.
Now, another question that I think I could probably also guess this answer, but maybe has a little bit more of an optimistic answer. How often do people come to you because they know there's something wrong, like maybe it's pain or something else, but then the solution or quote unquote cure or treatment or whatever takes them down a path that was very unexpected, to get to the root of the problem?
I think it can turn out being something they didn't expect, but usually people have a bit of an inkling about what it might be.
But do people ever come to you with a physical ailment, like some sort of chronic pain or something, but it turns out its root cause was, not a car accident or something, that it was something that was social, emotional, environmental?
Yes, absolutely. Not everybody wants to hear that though. So I know that John Serrano, wasn't it, that first started? He was a psychiatrist, and he first started working with people who got back pain for no apparent reason. All the scans showed there was nothing, and yet they would have debilitating back pain. And then that was when he started working on the emotional roots of that kind of back pain for them, because there wasn't anything physically wrong, nothing that could be found. So yes, there is an emotional component. There's always, like, you can't separate them out of the mind and the body. They interact.
I mean, that's really saying something, though. I mean, so do you find that it would, in your line of work, that while not always, but it should be expected and be looked at as one of the usual suspects, if you will, that there is an emotional root cause to physical pain, like that would need to be explored as just part of your regular checklist?
In an ideal world, yes. And some people I find are open to it. But in fact, if I have to be very careful if someone comes in with a physical pain, then they want to sit, lie on the couch and me fix it. I have to be very careful how I say anything because not everybody wants to hear that there might be, but also there might not be. I remember an osteopath friend of mine telling me that some guy came to him with a bad neck and it would come out back every fortnight. It'd be all right for a few days and then his neck would be bad again. And the osteopath would sort it out and he'd come back a fortnight later. And eventually he said to this guy, "There's something really wrong here. Tell me about your life." And it turned out this guy was trying to watch the television every night and there was a plant in the way. So he was tilting his head watching TV for 2 hours every night. And when he moved the plant, problem solved. So you need to look at everything. We can't assume. We have to look at the bigger picture and see what's going on. But often there can be, because normally if somebody came through with a neck problem, I would be starting to think about injustice. Usually neck problems are connected with the idea of some kind of injustice in people's lives.
Okay, so that's interesting. So neck, and for the final time, I'll say not always, but this is about what commonly could be, or as I like to say,
Yes.
you wouldn't be
Yes.
surprised to learn it was true.
Yes.
So injustice for neck. What about lower back?
Very lower back, the bottom sort of 4 or 5 vertebrae tend to start looking at lack of support, particularly financial support.
So if people are concerned about money, then you'll find that for whatever reason, right, or fears about money, or that they're going to have, disruption to their life because of lack of money.
Yes,
Then that can manifest in lower back.
It wouldn't surprise me at all if they got lower back pain, or if they came in lower back pain and that was going on in their lives.
Okay, what about? Go ahead.
But again, as I said, I have to be careful and look at the bigger picture. I don't want anyone to run away with the idea that you can be quite as glib as I'm being about it, because it's not quite as simple. But
sure, but
yes.
I don't think that you're necessarily being glib. And at the end of the day, the source of our pain or condition is the source of our pain and condition, right?
Yes, it is. Yes.
But I mean, I think maybe a lot of us could also understand likewise that if we're having knee pain and we're 125 pounds overweight, that maybe part of that solution would be to lose weight. But just because we know that doesn't mean we're necessarily going to take that action. So I get it, right? That
yes, but it's also interesting, isn't it? Not everybody's at 125 pounds overweight has knee pain. So why does one person have it and the other person not have it? So the overweight is a factor, but maybe there's something else going on.
Right. And so, okay, so continuing on with this, then I find this this is very fun as well as interesting. So knee pain, I'm going after like the obvious joints that are pretty common, at least for us over here in the United States. If you saw knee pain, what would be one of those places that you would look at?
One of the things I would start to think about with knee pain might be something to do with competition or who you're bowing to. Because we go down on our knees. With the body, we often think about what movement's involved and what would that represent. And we kneel on our knees, don't we?
So like an overbearing boss or something like that could maybe.
Might be that, yeah. Yeah. Or yes, either you're bowing to somebody or you're in competition with somebody. You don't want to have to bow to them, so you're competing.
Right. So then still using the business term, right? You could have some just battle axe of a coworker or whatever that you always just feel like you just, oh gosh, why is it always Gary or Brenda or whatever, that has to make life difficult?
That could, if the knee pain, I would start looking around, that kind of thing.
And then how about that in the elbow?
Elbow. Well, what do you do with an elbow?
Well, we lean on it, right? I mean, that's one thing that we use, and then we're using it to lift things up, right? Eating with and
yeah. So I've asked those questions about the elbow. One of the things that would commonly say, who are you elbowing away?
Okay, who are trying to nudge out.
That might be, that might be quite a common one.
And then it was.
But
Maybe
you're
it's,
right. Yeah, we lean on it. If that's the first person that's the first thing somebody said to me, well, we lean on an elbow, and I go, well, who are you leaning on, or who's leaning on you? That would be the first question I'd ask.
And sometimes it might be very physical. I have a child that just is a very needy, and they always want me to hold them, right? So that's now something that maybe that doesn't take a whole lot of like emotional fortitude to have to admit that part, right? So with a couple of minutes left here, and our time does seem to always go by so quick, Sue, then if you're engaging with people in that, it sounds like you would maybe then start to delicately prod of, what's your day like, or walk me through your day, or what's your job like, or what do you do at your job?
Yes.
Are you sitting for a long time, or are you lifting heavy things? And then you kind of maybe learn what you're learning through ancillary questions to maybe then start to explore the places.
Absolutely. But sometimes it's really quite straightforward. I have 2 or 3 guys that come to me who drive a lot, so they're sitting a lot. And they're sitting all the time, and their psoas muscles tighten up. It's just a given. There's nothing deep and mysterious or emotional about it. You sit all the time, your psoas muscles tighten up. It can't not happen.
You're actually having me taking some notes here. I'm thinking about these things.
That's a bit like the guy. That's a bit like the guy that was watching the television and tipping his neck. If you sit, you're going to put your psoas muscles tighten. They always do, and then people get that kind of slightly forward leaning or their hands forward, or low back pain because of it. So that can be a psoas muscle thing.
I've learned, actually, just as I do my podcast sometimes, that I get so engaged with the conversations that we're having now that I'll find myself leaning like this. But, I'm contorted, right? I mean, this is not a good posture. And I can sit there for like a half an hour, not even thinking about it. But then later in the day, I find myself all tight.
Yes. So there's no emotional component in that. It's just a physical. We are bodies. And if we put a physical strain on them or a repetitive something or other, we can have an effect on them. But then again, I would look at the bigger picture, and the guys that drive, I do encourage them to just get out and walk around as often as they can.
Right. So it's important to remember that it's not always because we had bad parents, as much as it's nice for us to just blame our parents for things.
Can't blame your parents for everything.
Well, Sue, thank you for joining us today. Sue Woodriffe. You can find her at, of all places, SueWoodriffe.co.uk, and Woodriffe is WOOD, but RIFFE. So SueWoodriffe.co.uk. You can look her up if you want to explore some alternative healing even more. And as always, Sue, I welcome you back to the show whenever you'd like to join us. It's a pleasure as always.
Thank you. It's been great. Take care.
And thank you all for tuning in. I'm Ross Morasso. Until next time.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com, or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, I mean, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house. And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned. This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.